Caring for Kids God's Way, a biblical counseling certificate program in child advocacy developed by the American Association of Christian Counselors through Light University. Your ministry is to be a Galatians 6:2 helper. Ours is to equip you with the highest level of advanced training from the world's leading Christian counselors. 24 experts teaming up to create the most comprehensive child studies curriculum for the personal classroom. May the Lord bless your study as you begin caring for kids God's way. She's an expert in how kids learn, founder and CEO of Apple Street Applied Learning Styles, and author of the book, I Hate School, How to Help Your Child Love Learning. Caring for Kids God's Way presents Cynthia Tobias with Learning Styles and Learning Disabilities.
I started my career in education many more years ago than I actually planned to tell you. I was pretty excited to teach. I got a teaching job as a high school teacher in a public high school, and I was so excited because I just knew that the kids I was teaching would be very excited to learn. And they weren't. In fact, most of them just felt like school was a prison sentence where they were waiting to be paroled or escape, and I was really puzzled. And one of the seasoned veterans there at the school came to me right away that first week, and he said, "Look, kid, you're new. Let me just tell you something about these kids that you're teaching." He said, "Half of them, they aren't even school material. You're going to so waste your time trying to teach kids who don't want to listen anyway. Here's what you do. Teach the ones who listen, let the rest go, let them drop through the cracks, don't worry about them." Wow. The trouble was, all the kids we were dropping through the cracks, they were my favorite kids. They were bright and creative and intuitive and kind of obnoxious. I sort of liked that. You know, they thought school was boring. Actually, so did I, and I was the teacher. I kept going into the faculty room that whole first year going, "Are you sure they're supposed to be this miserable? Because they're really miserable. Are they supposed to be this bored? Because really, shouldn't we be doing something to make them more?" And they would say, "Look, how long you been teaching? You'll find out soon enough. Education is not supposed to be interesting, and it's not supposed to be fun and entertaining. It's supposed to teach them how to be structured and disciplined." And oh wow, no wonder they were kind of bored. Every summer I'd go back to work. Because as you know, if you're a public school teacher or you know a public school teacher, we could pay plenty of money, but it's kind of fun to work in the summer. And I also wanted to stay real experienced in a lot of business and find out, were we really sending kids into the corporate culture with what they needed? I got to work a lot of neat jobs. I got to work for Morty the Mission Meatball. I got to chauffeur limousines one summer. I got to do a lot of neat things. But what I figured out from the very first summer, you get hired for all the things you got in trouble for in school. You know, the human resources departments, you know what they're looking for in good employees? Let's see, good social interaction, high energy level, independent thinking skills. Oh wow, we're not only not fostering those in the classroom, we're actively discouraging them. That didn't make any sense at all. I spent several years as a police officer, actually, because one of my summer jobs turned into a little bit more than that. And because I was a teacher and I was working with police officers, they said, "Why don't you teach adults at the police academy?" Adults, that would be great, because adults, they'll be excited to learn. But they weren't. In fact, I would say that the adults were even less excited to learn than the kids were. And I was trying to figure out, what is this? I mean, learning and experience and knowledge is supposed to be exciting. They don't want to do it. Why is that? You know, over the past 18 and a half years, I've sort of made a real concentrated study of that, looking at learning styles and the way that we learn and the way our minds work and process. And you know what we figured out? School doesn't really bring out the best in very many people sometimes. And over the last decade especially, we've, instead of making school adapt to the current technology and to the current excitement of kids, what we tend to do is we tend to insist that school stays just the way it's always been. So what are we doing now? Well, we're finding that more and more and more kids can't cope with traditional classrooms, can't cope with traditional schools. We have more and more labels, more and more disabilities, more and more kids we're pulling out of school so that we teach them to cope. And it's a little crazy. You know, the last 3 or 4 years I've been talking a lot to kids, more to kids than to parents, and really asking them, why do you not like school? Why is school so frustrating for you? Why is it so boring? I've talked to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids. And in my most recent book, The I Hate School, How to Help Your Kids Love Learning, I quote them. And through teaching with and working with all these kids, you know, we came up with 3 main reasons why kids seem to hate school. And I want to tell you those 3 reasons because I think they especially relate to why so many kids are not really dealing very well with the traditional classroom. Now, are there really some kids with learning disabilities? Absolutely. Are there kids with some very severe needs, neurological, physiological needs? Absolutely. But what if that's not the problem? What if we can take down some lines of first defense first? What if there are some things we can do before they ever get to the point where they have to be diagnosed with a disability? What if that could happen? Well, here's the 3 major reasons. See what you think, because I think if you admit it as an adult, I mean, think about this for a minute. What are you doing now that would have gotten you in trouble in school? Aren't you in a business where you talk too much, where you think creatively? But in school it's not there. Well, the 3 reasons, and kids said this overwhelmingly. Number 1 reason that kids hate school, and these aren't just kids who don't get good grades. I have boys, I have twins, and they're in a private Christian school, and they've always done really well, and they get A's and B's, and they still hate school. They don't hate learning, and they don't hate their teacher. They hate certain traditional aspects of school. And across the board, kids who did well and kids who didn't do well still all said, number 1 reason that they hate school, we serve the wrong customer. That's right, we serve the wrong customer. When you think about school and education in general, who's the customer? Who's supposed to be the customer? Well, I mean, probably you're thinking the student, but they're not. They couldn't possibly be the customer. You know, if the student were the customer, we wouldn't have desks that were designed in the 18th century. Have you sat in a school desk lately? I don't know any business person anywhere that would agree to sit in a school desk and work for even an hour, let alone the 6 hours that we expect our kids to do. Those desks are extremely uncomfortable. Some of them are even still attached to the chairs. And you know, if you're a tall person, a rather large person, packing a few extra pounds, and you sit in a desk with a chair connected, when you get up, so does the desk. That's not only uncomfortable, that's humiliating. And it's no wonder that you don't do well in class sitting in that chair. Who's got the corner on school furniture? Who decided that that's what they have to do? Because most of us would not like sitting in there. And what if you're a little kid and your feet are really short, your legs are short, and you sit in a school desk and your feet don't even touch the ground? What happens in about 5 minutes? Wow, your foot starts going to sleep and your whole leg, and pretty soon you're squirming, and now you are a discipline problem and you better stop it and you're in trouble. Wow, you didn't mean to be a discipline problem, it's just legs are going to sleep. Man, physical discomfort makes me squirm and fidget and be really uncomfortable and gets me in trouble over and over and over again. If the kids were the customer, we'd be a lot more aware of how to make a classroom more conducive to learning. If you sit with no padding, you know what? Your butt gets hurt, it gets sore, it gets tired, and you get fidgety, and that's not unusual. If students were the customer, we wouldn't start school so early. Why are we starting school at 7:30 in the morning or 7:45 with no other options? There just aren't that many people that are just dying to go to school that early, especially if you're a teenager. We'd have school starting at different times. We have morning people and afternoon people. You know, the research has shown very clearly that not everyone is productive at the same time of day. You know that. If you're not at your best in the morning, but you still have to take all your hardest classes in the morning, you could have 2 strikes against you before you ever start. What if you're not good at math? What if you're not a morning person and you have math every single morning? You know what? You can be a kid sitting in that desk, focusing as much as you can, trying as hard as you can, and you still have so many cobwebs in your head. You are so fuzzy, you're doing terrible in math. Everybody's worried about you, they're frustrated with you, they're telling you you ought to pay better attention and you ought to just do better, and you thought you were, you're trying to do it, but you're just not quite clicking. That's because school, you know what we're doing in school? We primarily design it for the convenience of those who teach kids, not for the kids who are being taught. And it is in that gap and with that rub that we find more and more and more kids are not being as successful. Now, I was in Minnesota when the book first came out, the I Hate School book, and I was talking about this because I know it's a little controversial to say, well, the kid should be the student. And I was speaking at a school, and some teachers at lunch pulled me aside, and one of the teachers said, she said, I represent a group of my colleagues. Wow, you always hate to kind of hear that. She said, we love your books, we love what you're talking about, we really agree learning styles is very important. She said, but we are very uncomfortable with the idea that the student would be the customer. She said, because the customer is always right. She said, you can't let students be the customer. They would want to run the place. They wouldn't even want school. They wouldn't respect us. They'd want to determine all the rules. They'd want to call all the shots. It's impossible to let students be the customer. I said, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I'm from Seattle, and we are the flagship store for Nordstrom. And I freely admit I do love Nordstrom. Now, I'm not a high ticket customer at Nordstrom because I don't have that much money, but I do love shopping at Nordstrom because they just really care. They go out of their way. And even though I love Nordstrom and I'm a really good customer, I don't actually have much control over Nordstrom. You know, when you think about it, I can't control who they hire or who they fire or any of their employee policy. I don't have any control over their sale prices or their inventory or their merchandise or their store hours. Wow, as a matter of fact, I don't have any control over Nordstrom at all. But the fact that I'm a customer, it means that Nordstrom is constantly, consistently looking for ways for me as the customer to want to keep coming back. See, we're not doing that in education. We're forcing those kids to do it our way, at our convenience, at our time. And you know what? They do. They'll come through and they'll survive it. But what good will it be if when they get out, they never want to come back? And we're finding that more and more and more. Who wants to come back to a place who says, you know, you really got to try harder. Your mind isn't very good at this. I think we'll give you some medication here, or we'll give you a special diagnosis here, or we'll somehow get you through, but you don't seem all that capable in school. Who wants to keep learning the rest of your life if you're constantly struggling with that? If we were truly going to make schools effective for learners, the kids themselves will tell you, they need to be the customer. That doesn't mean they need Club Med. It doesn't mean they need to have anything. They don't need to be let off the hook. I talked to hundreds and hundreds of kids who hated school. Not one single student hated learning. They don't want to be dumb. They won't tell you, I don't want any school and I just want to lay around all day at home. They don't. It's just that they want education that actually takes them into account, not necessarily just those who are teaching them. If the students were truly the customers, we would run schools very, very differently. We found out one of the second main reasons that kids hate school, well, because we don't focus on strengths. I still remember very clearly several years ago, we were doing a program with Learning Styles where we had one-on-one counselors. And they were really not counselors. We worked with counselors, but our part of the counseling part was just a learning style specialist thing. We do one-on-one learning styles assessment with strengths. Nothing else. That was our only area of expertise. And one day we got a call, and there was a school counselor who had referred a mom and David Neely, we'll call him, he was a second grader, to a counselor that was just down the hall from us. And so David Neely and his mother came into the office, and the counselor looked at David Neely's file, and he was in second grade, remember, but it was always 3 inches thick already. It said that he had attention deficit disorder, he had dyslexia, he had anger management problems, he probably had oppositional defiant disorder, he had, a dysfunctional family. I mean, it's second grade, and it's 3 inches thick. Well, the counselor picked up the file, and he called the school counselor on the telephone, and he said, I see David Neely's file here, and I see a lot of things that he really needs to work on. I'm wondering, could you tell me what are some of David Neely's strengths? And the counselor told us later, he said the school psychologist that he was talking to, the school counselor, what he said next surprised him so much he wrote it down word for word. Because the school counselor said, oh, I'm sorry, we're not set up to deal with strengths. Well, that's true. I mean, education has never been set up to focus on, to diagnose, to figure out what a child does well. We don't look at ways for strengths. We look at ways to diagnose weakness. We look at ways to remediate things that need to be remediated. We look at everything they don't do very well and how to fix it. Wow, it's no wonder they don't really want to come to school that much. It's no wonder they feel like they're not quite capable when it comes to being learners. It's a matter of looking at our strengths. Now here's where we have to face some truth. In our society, and especially in our education system, we have a pretty analytic mindset. Now, Herman Witkin was a psychological researcher back during World War II, and what I'm about to tell you for the next few minutes has a lot to do with his research. He discovered, and he's one of the few cognitive researchers that has a very high reliability, he discovered that every single person who's born is born sort of pre-wired, cognitively, how their mind works, how information comes in, how it's processed, how it's put back out. He discovered that not only are we kind of born pre-wired along a continuum, I mean, no one's all or nothing, everyone can do both, but we have 2 different ways of actually our mind working with information. And about 50-50 in the population, not only of the United States, but the world, about 50% of the whole population has a mind pre-wired to be more analytic, which means when information comes in, we automatically break it down piece by piece, step by step, beginning, middle, end. Step 1, step 2, step 3, put it together, put a framework. That's how your mind works. Now, if you are one of those 50%, and it goes between the genders, if you're one of those 50% who's highly analytic by nature, it comes as second nature to you. School's not that big a deal. You know, it may not be that challenging, but it's just not that difficult. It's pretty straightforward. Everything happens, everything gets outlined, everything gets done. No problem. But what if you're in the other 50%? I'm in the other 50%. We call it more global, big picture, intuitive learner. A full 50% of us are, even though the school system itself is highly analytic, at least 50% of us out here are not analytic naturally. Since we are more global, intuitive, big picture learners, we have to actually learn it, then translate it into being something analytic enough, product-wise, to get credit for being half as smart as we really are. So if you're a highly global, intuitive learner, wow, you already have a little bit of a disadvantage even going into school. People already think you're not paying attention. There's a reason for that. Of course, you are paying attention, but we don't pay attention to the same things. I can still remember in class and in school as a student, I would listen for things that weren't even said. I mean, in a high school physics class, you know, the teacher would say, okay, today we're going to talk about Einstein's special theory of relativity. I'd sit there thinking, wow, how did he think of that? Where was his laboratory? Did he lease office space? Did he have it in his garage? Was Einstein married? Because I don't remember reading about a wife, some kids. I mean, how would that be if you were Einstein's kids and your classmates asked and you said, you know, my dad's Einstein, why don't you just deal with it? That would be pretty cool. By the time I've kind of worked through that and kind of tuned back in, I realize, oh, I've missed some really important parts. Now I have to ask the kid next to me, what are we supposed to, oh, you're so stupid. Why don't you pay attention? Why aren't you listening? Man, I thought I was listening. See, I wasn't talking or anything. I just didn't realize that my global, big picture mind had jerked me back, made me think about all this other stuff before I could kind of focus in on what I was supposed to do. I look stupid, and I'm not stupid. I'm just pretty highly global. I could tell you what the teacher wore that day, but I might not have gotten the homework assignment. Not because I actually wasn't listening, but because I was kind of listening to too much. I was trying to figure out what the context was and where my friends were, and I'm not stupid. I'm not dumb. But my highly analytic mind, it's not highly analytic. It's very definitely global. And it's really a little bit like the right hand and the left hand. Now, if you think about it, if you've got two hands, nobody could work with two left hands or two right hands. You need one of each. But you see the world from totally opposite perspectives. And even though each one serves totally different jobs and responsibilities, in a classroom, in a typical classroom or school, there is one teacher and there is one way, and the other hand just has to adapt and try to be like the hand that teaches. It's no wonder that we struggle. And a lot of times, highly global kids struggle. Now, a lot of people would say, well, if you're a global kid, you're going to struggle in an analytic, picky, detail-oriented teacher's class. I think that's probably true, but I've always been a highly global, intuitive learner, and I was that kind of teacher too. So you know who struggled in my classrooms? Was the analytic kids. You know, I just thought, before I knew about learning styles, I honestly just thought that an analytic kid was just wound too tight. You know, they ought to just relax. They ought to just kind of go with the flow. They come into class, they say, what are we going to do, and where am I supposed to be, and how long is it supposed to be? And I would say, you know, you should just relax. Just kind of let life go with the flow, and why don't you just relax and not worry about it? And I think I was frustrating them, and I didn't mean to. You know, I'd say, why don't you write me a paragraph about the tooth fairy? How many words? Blue or black ink? Do you want my name on the right-hand side or the left-hand side? Should I abbreviate the date or spell it out? Should I fold that in half this way or that way? Do you want to do it at the beginning, middle, or end of the class? Whatever. What is the matter with you? I just really couldn't understand. I wasn't trying to be frustrating and irritating to them on purpose. I just didn't know. I didn't understand until I learned more about learning styles that one man's boredom is another man's security. That one kid working one way is another kid's most frustrating way. And if they're really the customers and I'm trying with all my heart to get them to learn, I have to figure out and help them figure out what their strengths are. And instead of focusing on what they're not doing well, if I can help that highly global kid and that highly analytic kid truly focus on how their mind works, it's amazing. I mean, we have some amazing success stories when you figure out what you're pretty good at and what you're not so good at, and use what you're pretty good at to overcome it. Now, if you're highly global, the chances are good, as you're listening to me even now, you're figuring out, well, yeah, I'm probably not the smartest person in school, and I didn't get the best grades, and school didn't bring out the best. But you know what? You're a lot smarter than you think you are. And an awful lot of the kids that we're working with are so much smarter than we thought we are. I have two boys. I mentioned that earlier. I have twins, Robert and Michael. Mike is a highly analytic child. He's very strong-willed. My mother prayed that that would be so, because you kind of get what you deserve, and what goes around comes around. Mike, highly analytic. He has always done really well in math and science, gotten straight A's. Robert, my sort of global son, he does really well in drama and in English and in all the things that he loves, but he really struggles in math and science. And here they are exactly the same age, 2 minutes apart. And they're in the same school, and they're in the same classes with the same teacher. But one child looks like he's really smart, and another child looks like he's not that smart. And they both are identically smart. They just do it in such different ways. Even early on when they were little, I can still remember Rob at age 4 coming to me and saying, "Mommy, we need Trix cereal." And I would say, "You want to eat Trix for breakfast?" No, I don't want to eat it. He would say, "I just think it's really mean of those kids on TV to never give the rabbit any Trix." He said, "Mommy, if I ever see that rabbit, I just want to be able to give him my box of Trix." That's just Robert. Mike, Mr. Analytic, Mr. Strong-willed, just the opposite. He's a great kid too, but he doesn't even think like anybody else. I still remember when they were younger, overhearing them at the airport arguing back and forth. And in the middle of the argument, Mike said, wait, let's flip an imaginary coin. Robert said, "Okay." Mike said, "I call heads." Rob said, "Okay, tails." "Oh, heads, I win." Rob said, "I always lose." Robert, is he stupid? Is he dumb? No, he's just thinking, in a whole different perspective and in a whole different way. Could he be taken advantage of? Oh yeah, pretty regularly by his highly analytic brother at times. But it's not because he's dumb. It's because his mind works in a different pattern and works in a different way. As a kid in a classroom, if I'm highly global, my strength is more trying to figure out what it is, what it's all about, what it's doing. So when the teacher puts the definition on the board, I don't write that down because I don't know what that means. I'm waiting for the magic phrase. In other words, oh good, yeah, I got it. But then the test comes by, you know what's on the test? Oh wow, that would be the definition I didn't write down. In fact, I don't even recognize half the stuff. When did we ever talk about this? I mean, I was there every day, sitting in class, but it didn't occur to me that that's what you were talking about. I didn't know you were going to be so picky. If you are a highly analytic person, you just automatically kind of pay attention to detail. If you're not, you're at a loss. Let's think about this for a minute. When it comes to something like attention deficit disorder, between the highly analytic folks of the world and the highly global folks of the world, who probably invented the term and listed the symptoms for attention deficit disorder? Analytics. So who falls in that category more often than anyone else? Globals. I match most of the symptoms on a typical ADD list, but I don't actually have it. I just don't listen if you're boring. See, there's a difference. There are legitimate neurological, physiological disabilities and disorders. But what happens for every one of those if we dump 8 kids in? They just don't pay attention. They talk too much. They move too much. They won't sit still in class. They won't focus on that. They can't do their tests. What if it's not because of a neurological problem? What if it has a lot more to do with what their learning style is? And I just wonder, who decided what's normal anyway? I mean, I just need to ask you that, because who decided that sitting still was normal? Why don't we worry about kids who don't move? Why don't we medicate them? Perhaps we're medicating the wrong people. I mean, I say this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but maybe the parents and teachers ought to be sedated just a little more and let the kids be the customers. Even though that's tongue-in-cheek, I think you understand what I'm saying. When I'm saying we are so focused on getting kids to sit still, be quiet, don't move, pay attention, listen to me. That's not how the world works. And that doesn't help them learn sometimes. Do this, even as you're sitting there listening to me. Maybe take out a piece of paper or put something on a scratch paper. Just make a couple notes. Let's just talk for a minute about your strengths. We've already talked a little bit about the physical environment of school, but let's think about you, just you, not as a parent, not as a teacher, not as a counselor, not as anything, but just you as a learner. What if you could be just any way you wanted to be and just have anything you wanted to do? Think about, when would you be at your best? Would you be at your best early in the morning, late at night, somewhere in the afternoon? Just jot that down or think about that. When is the best time of day for you? Do you know the research says that those strengths, if you do your hardest things at your best time of day and your easiest things at your worst time of day, that one change alone can literally almost double your effectiveness and productivity. You have something to do you hate? Try to do it at your very best time of day. Kids aren't always given that choice. Sometimes, and we've tried many experiments, I'm encouraged to say a lot of schools are catching on to this, and if you look at some of the standardized tests, they'll offer them twice during a day. You can either take it at 8 o'clock in the morning when you first get to school, or you can elect to take it at 1 o'clock in the afternoon after lunch. You know, for some kids who aren't morning kids, taking that test at 1 o'clock greatly improves their score, and vice versa. So think about that. Now think about this. You know, for some of you, your strength, believe it or not, is the fact that you talk too much. You know who you are. And you know, we found out that if you're a highly auditory learner, your greatest strength is learning by hearing, but not learning by hearing other people talk to you. If you're highly auditory, it means that you learn best by hearing yourself talk to you. Oh wow, that's a whole different ballgame. See, because if you're highly auditory, you talk a lot. You don't even realize you're talking. In fact, you get in trouble in class because you just blurt out an answer as soon as it occurs to you. You know you're supposed to raise your hand. You meant to. You've been told a million times, but you know, it just occurred to you. And you have to tell somebody. If you can't tell the teacher, you have to tell somebody. Oh, that is so true. And you know, the murmurs that break out in a classroom or a congregation anywhere, it's just in spite of yourself. You have to say it. It's very frustrating. It gets you in trouble. You're supposed to be quiet. You're supposed to pay attention. But until you actually, if you're a highly auditory learner, until you actually hear your own voice talk about it, you aren't going to remember it very well. So you actually have to discuss it at some point fairly quickly, or it's all going to leave you. The other thing that's interesting and very frustrating in a classroom, and especially elementary teachers will tell you this, with the auditory kids, you know, we'll say, boys and girls, today we're going to talk about animal cruelty. Oh, my aunt, she had this dog. You know, we don't actually have time to listen to everybody's story. If you'll just hang on to your aunt's dog story, at the end, if there's time, we'll let you tell it. Oh, wow, see, my aunt's dog story is like right here. Right here. There's no room for anything else to come in until my aunt's dog story comes out. So it would be a whole waste of time for me to just sit there holding on to my aunt's dog story. I've got to tell somebody. So I turn, I tell my neighbor, I get in trouble yet again. I get notes on my report card over and over and over again. She's entirely too social. She talks too much. She doesn't listen enough. Something's wrong. She's not paying attention. You know what? I really just have to talk to you a little bit. Even as a very young child, you can notice highly auditory learners need to verbalize a lot of times. And with a highly auditory child, if you're not a highly, well, especially even if you are a highly auditory parent, you want them to shut up. Just shut up for a little while. Stop talking because you want to think. If you're a highly auditory teacher, you say shh more than anybody else because you need to talk. And we don't always understand that the strength of that child is being able to sit down, talk about it, discuss it, work as a group, work in a project. You put me in a classroom where you don't let me talk. I'm sitting in an uncomfortable desk at the wrong time of day. I don't get it. And you're assuming that there is something wrong with me. One of the things that frustrates me, parents will come and say frequently, wow, the teacher has said about my son that she thinks I ought to test him for ADD. And so I'm just wondering, you know, because he doesn't pay attention in class, I think we ought to test him. The first question I tell every parent who's told that to ask is, what were you asking him to pay attention to? Why are we so quick to assume that if a child is not paying attention, that there's something wrong with the child? Have you been to school lately? There are boring things there, and sometimes they are taught in boring ways. Don't automatically assume that it is a learning disability if it's put across in a boring way, and I'm a pretty creative, artistic, sort of restless kid, why are you assuming that it's my problem? Now, here again, do we insist that teachers change, insist that schools change? Are we saying that we should bend over backwards because the child is the customer and make school just bow and do whatever they want? Of course not. There's always accountability. But in that accountability is the customer. And trying to decide, is it the child who is deficient, or is it the way we are delivering the message that is deficient? It's an important distinction. And I asked permission. In fact, I called Robert today before filming this because Robert, my global son, he's really struggled in math. And I asked his permission to tell you because he's been scared to tell me that the last 5 math tests, now this is the end of the school year almost, the last 5 math tests have been Fs. Fs. And I finally got a progress report from the teacher. And he said he's just got a flat F. He does all right on the daily homework. He does all right on the daily work. F all the way across. Well, Robert and I had a heart-to-heart talk, and I said, Robert, F, you've got to do something. And he goes, no, I'll really study, I'll really try. So he got a tutor, and he sat down, and he tried, and he went and he took another test last week. He came home, and I said, well, how'd you do on the math test? And he said, and this is so typical, again, of a global, he said, it was great. It was great. He said, I got good news and bad news. He said, the good news is everybody did kind of the same, and the bad news is we all flunked. How is that good news? What did you get, Robert? Out of 100, 37. I went, 37? How could this get worse? Well, we sat out in the swing just 3 days ago, and I said, let's think about your strengths, Robert, your learning style strengths. I know you feel dumb in math, because he said, I just can't do math. What do you do really well? He said, Mom, the reason I do my homework so well is, he says, I have the TV on, I have music going, I can get my homework done as long as there's noise. He said, but in the classroom, when I have to take the test, it is so quiet. I can't even think about anything except that it's quiet. So we brainstormed a little, and I said, do you think Mr. Fenton would let you have headphones on with a CD and just listen to music while you took the test? He said, I don't know, but it would really be worth a try. Well, I dropped a little note to Mr. Fenton and said, no pressure, but let's just try it. So long story short, 2 days ago, Rob took the test, this time listening to a classic 1980s country music CD. We tried to choose something that the teacher wouldn't be offended by. The teacher approved it. Rob had the headphones. I just got word last night because Robert called me. He said, Mom, you'll never guess. I said, how'd you do on the test? He said, I got a 90. A 90. From 37 to 90. Listening to headphones, it's not always that easy, and it's not always that drastic, but you know what? Looking at a child's strengths and figuring it out from there can make an amazing difference. Focusing on the strengths and looking at it their way, not necessarily our way. Which kind of brings me to the third point. Kids hate school because they're not the customer. Kids hate school because nobody looks at strengths. They only look at what you're not very good at. And the third, and maybe one of the most frustrating things, is the fact that we confuse accountability with tests. How do you feel about tests? Would you like to take the SAT this Saturday and publish your scores in the local paper? You wouldn't? You know what? Tests aren't that much of a favorite among anybody, although the highly analytic kids don't seem to mind it, because in some ways, and some of them will even admit to you, that it makes them look smarter than a lot of the global kids. As a more global, intuitive learner, I'm pretty sure that the tests are out to deliberately make me look stupid, and I'm pretty paranoid about it. But most of the time, we don't even know what the point of the tests are. I know in the state of Washington we have a test called the WASL, and I've been in every state in the union, and I know that every state has a test they hate. Because the teachers seem to have to teach to the test, and parents are frustrated with their kids because they're not doing well on the test. And the bottom line is, one of the reasons that we hate standardized testing so much is that half the time, at least, we don't even know what the test is supposed to measure. If you could tell me what the test is supposed to measure, I might be able to find another way to measure the very same thing, because I don't believe you should ever lower any standards. I don't believe you should ever compromise on behaviors. You should not let kids get by with bad behavior. You should not dumb down a system. But you should be able to ask and answer a really important question. That is, what's the point? What are we trying to accomplish here? What is it they should know? What is it they should be able to prove? And if we do that, then there may be 3 or 4 different ways to get there that could actually accommodate a student's strengths if we wanted to. It's a big change, and I know that education reform's been around for a lot of years and we haven't had much success at it. But one of the key things that we're finally catching on to is that we can't really reform education until we know what it is we're shooting for. What is it we're trying to measure? What is it we want those kids to do? And it's not just that we want them to sit still and be quiet, it's that we want them to learn. Well, what if they're like Robert? And in order to learn, the last thing they need is quiet. Are we willing to accommodate that? Or should I put him in a special classroom and give him a label and make him feel that he's probably not quite as adequate, not quite as smart as his highly analytic brother? Accountability. It should always stay intact. Here's where both parents and teachers get a little frustrated, because you want to go to the school and you want to say, you know, rather than take my child through a battery of tests to see if there's something wrong with him, before we do that, you know, couldn't we try a few other things? And even teachers will say, it's very frustrating. How would I change the school system? Everything's so set in stone. How am I going to get teachers to understand? How am I going to get administrators to change in a school system? And it's an uphill battle and it's daunting, but there is a way to at least start. And I tell teachers who are trying to change administrators or parents who are trying to change teachers, you start at the end. Okay, again, with accountability. You say to that teacher, okay, so the bottom line is, if I understand correctly, we're trying to accomplish this. Is that correct? And you get the teacher to say, or the administrator to say, yes, that is what we're trying to accomplish. Then you can say, if I could prove that doing this accomplished that, would you be willing to let me try? You're kind of caught. See, he's kind of caught because you just defined what it was you were trying to measure. You defined your accountability. And so, as long as you're going to reach that, shouldn't we at least, as different kinds of learners, shouldn't we at least be allowed to try a different method to get to the same thing? What if it's something simple? I dealt with, when the boys were just in 4th grade, I went into Robert's 4th grade class. And I did a small version of a child learning style survey. And one of the reasons I went in his class, his teacher had asked me to come in because he had a classmate, we'll call him Sam. And Sam, they had not been able to figure out anything. Sam could not focus and concentrate in class. They had tried everything. He wouldn't get his work done in class. He wouldn't concentrate. He wouldn't listen to the teacher. They had tested him for everything, ADD, ODD, dyslexia. Everything they had tested him for, and he hadn't shown any of that. So they were beside themselves with frustration. Well, we kind of started out with a little questionnaire, because I'm a great advocate of asking the kids themselves. If you're frustrated with them, if they're not getting it, define what it is you want them to get and ask them. So one of the things we did was give them that survey, and it had kind of sentence completion on it. And for Sam, almost every sentence was answered with the same thing. It would say, I would like coming to school better if, and he said the air conditioning was fixed in the portables. I would listen to my teacher better in class if it wasn't so hot in the classroom. I think I would learn better if I could just be cooler. I mean, this was a recurrent theme. And his teacher and I, we looked at each other and we said, it can't be that easy. But we went out to the dollar store and we bought a little portable battery-operated clip-on fan, and we brought it back to the classroom and we clipped it on Sam's desk and we turned the fan on, and Sam went and started paying attention. We tracked it. A full 80% improvement between then and the end of the school year in Sam's attention. See, the biggest problem with Sam wasn't attention deficit disorder or any kind of psychological problem. The biggest problem with Sam was that he was totally, overwhelmingly, uncomfortably hot. Sometimes we overlook the obvious. Sometimes we overlook the lines of least resistance before we decide that the child is a lost cause, before we decide that the child is nothing but a behavior problem. We need to look not only at the accountability, what we're trying to get them to do, but at the strengths. Are they physically uncomfortable? Does it make sense to their mind? How does their mind work in the first place? Think about the strengths of yourself as you're sitting there and you've listened long enough to figure out what do you think? I mean, what are some of the biggest physical aspects for you even now as an adult learner, where if you were going to go into a classroom and be totally comfortable and really be able to focus, what would it need to look like? I mean, maybe even jot down a couple. Would you need to be hot? Would you need to be cold? Would you need to have somebody there? Would you need to have a little music? Some of you would need absolute quiet. How would it look for you, even as an adult? And let me just tell you this. However it looks for you as an adult is probably going to be just the opposite of how it looks for your child. And parents, they can panic. I mean, I had one lady come up to me in a PTA meeting and she said, my 5th grade daughter, she's just using this as a big fat excuse. She said she tells me on Thursday nights that she can only do her homework between 8 and 8:30 while she watches her favorite television show. She said, that's a big fat excuse. I said, well, there's one way to find out. As long as it's a television show you approve of, go ahead and let her do it between 8 and 8:30. Have her do her homework. But you know what you should do at 8:30? Collect the homework. If it's done and done well and done completely, no matter how it would be for you, you get to say, wow, you know, this would never work for me. But it obviously works for you, and she gets to do it. If, however, at 8:30, the homework's not done, or it's not complete, or it's not legible, as the parent, you get to say, nice try. We're not going to do that again. Because see, I'm still going to always come back to the accountability. I'm going to always come back to saying, I realize that this is one of your strengths and your style, but you know what? It's not working. With Robert, he knew that he had one shot and one shot only. I said, you realize you're taking this CD into a classroom. During a test, you're going to listen to music. If it doesn't work, Robert Tobias, if it doesn't work, you are never going to be able to do it again. He pulled through, and most kids will. See, that's why I think when it comes to education reform, rather than doing more medication, rather than doing more pullouts and more special education, before we do all that, shouldn't we take another look at the accountability? Shouldn't we take another look at a child's strengths? And shouldn't we give them the opportunity to say, I think I could do it a different way? I was speaking at a large church up at the Canadian border, and it's one of those churches that was in a huge warehouse. They run, you know, thousands of people. And I was doing it was a Saturday class for parents on family seminar. And they had carpet on the floor, and they had padded chairs. And as you walk in, because we were near Seattle, as you walk in the door of this church, there are huge Starbucks urns. So anytime the church doors are open, you can come in and you can get a cup of coffee anytime, all the time, anywhere. And I was kind of, you know, praying and walking around the empty chairs before it started. And I mentioned to the family pastor, I said, wow, there's a lot of coffee stains on the carpet and on the chairs. You can tell they really take advantage of drinking the coffee. He said, yeah, you know, we're building a new worship center. He said last Sunday in church, he said, our pastor stopped right in the middle of the sermon. And he said, you know, many of you have asked me, Pastor, in the new worship center, are we still going to be allowed to bring coffee in? He said, I just want you to listen to me very carefully. He said, we want the whole county to come spill coffee on our seats, because that's why we're here. That's who the customers are. We should be less concerned with how messy and inconvenient it gets, and more concerned with who it is we're targeting, what it is we're trying to accomplish. Do you realize, especially with your own kids, I know you realize, they have incredible, complex, fearfully, wonderfully made minds. And for so many of those kids, they seem unmotivated in school. They seem bored. They seem like they're not really coming up to their potential. You know that they're smart. So what's the answer? Is the answer medication? Not as often as we do it, really. I mentioned in my new book, I was at Disneyland when the boys were pretty young. And we were at, I don't know if you're familiar, at Disneyland they have the Chip and Dale house, you know, where they can bounce across the rubber house. And the kids just go wild. And we were sitting there waiting for the boys to come out, and there was this one man, he was just frantic. His little boy was in there, and he was correcting him, and no, don't jump too high on that, and don't jump too high on that. And about halfway through, he turned to me in frustration. He said, see, take him off a Ritalin, what do you get? I wanted to say, this is Disneyland. Disneyland. And sometimes it's not that you don't have times when a child needs to focus. You do. It's not that you don't teach kids how to cope with situations that aren't comfortable. You do. But it is a matter of our taking a really good, hard look before we decide there's something wrong with the child, and ask ourselves, what if it's something wrong with the system? What if it's something wrong with the delivery of what we're doing? What if it's actually something wrong with even, and I have to admit this as a parent, my ways are very different than my son's sometimes. I like different things. I have an idea of how it's supposed to be. And you know, I'm living proof that my way works. So since I'm the adult and they're the children, I tend to kind of just bulldoze my way through and do it my way. And it doesn't always work that way. Look at your list of strengths. Keep making a list of strengths. Think about you as a learner. And then ask your child. One of the things that we challenge parents to do, whether it's with my books or somebody else's, get a book and a highlighter that is about learning styles and give it to your school-age children who read, and just have them highlight everything through the book that just jumps out at them and says, yeah, this is me, this is me. And then when you get it back and you read through it, you know what? You will probably be amazed, because a lot of times you'll have very interesting dinner time conversation going, really? This is what you want? This is, oh, I would never be able to do this. And back and forth, you get a very healthy dialogue. Again, getting back to the accountability, but focusing on the child as a customer. I remember many years ago, David Kiersey, many of you will be familiar with him. He wrote Please Understand Me. He's a temperament researcher. And I was at a psychological type conference, and this must have been probably 12 years ago, but I've never forgotten the story he told at the very end of the conference. He stood up there and he said he had been flying cross country on an airplane, and he had sat next to a young mother with a brand new baby. And he said that wasn't so unusual, except he said this mother had no arms. She had been born with no arms. There were just short stubs. And he said, I was just fascinated. He said, because she had that newborn baby and she did everything with her feet, and she was just incredibly talented. And he said, I kept to myself as long as I could. And he said, finally, I just had to ask her. I said, I'm so sorry to ask you this, but I just have to know. Don't you find it incredibly difficult to have a baby and to have no arms? Well, this young mother, she looked right at him and she said, you know what? I'll tell you the truth. There's one major drawback. And David Kiersey said, what's that? She goes, watch. Quickly, with her feet, she reached into the diaper bag, very expertly with her feet, got the bottle, brought it to the baby, who with his feet put the bottle in his mouth. His arms lay useless by his side. See, he didn't know he had them. As parents, as teachers, we are such powerful role models for our children. And we tend to forget that sometimes, most of the time, God has given us a child that is very different from us. The child's not our possession, someone that we have to focus and control our way. This child is a gift, full of strengths that we may not even recognize and certainly may not always match with our own. But it is an incredible privilege, an incredible honor to be able to be in those kids' lives and to help them learn to discover and appreciate how they were designed. We have the most amazing advantage because we know the creator and the designer of the universe, and we know that he made us differently. Shouldn't we, as Christian parents, as Christian educators, shouldn't we be leading the way, in the education system especially, for helping those children truly focus on strengths and figure out how to use it in the very best possible way? It won't be the same for everyone, it never is. But we can come up with the same accountability, and we can come up with the very same product and strengths and find so many different ways to get there. So pull out your strengths list, kind of keep track. You know, you don't have to have a credential, or you don't have to be a counselor, and you don't have to be an expert. You can be an observer. You can be a discusser and a talker of things and talk to your kids. Ask them, what do you do best? What would motivate you? What do you like? And then listen, because you know what? It may really truly amaze you. When you pay attention for just a little while, you will find out and discover and know how to use the way they learn. Thank you. God bless you. Thank you for listening to this, and thank you for keeping an open mind for the kids you love most.